Welcome to the deep dive. We've had a really extraordinary request come in, and we're going to tackle it today. A complete, detailed, chronological history of Spain.
All of it.
All of it. From, the deepest prehistory
Right.
right up to the very complex geopolitical and economic situation of 2025.
It's a huge task.
It is. This isn't just a timeline, is it? It's really a mission to synthesize millennia of conquest, empire, cultural revolution, and, well, rebirth.
It is. It's monumental, but I think it's a necessary one.
Yeah.
At most popular histories of Spain, they tend to focus on the Golden Age or maybe the Civil War.
Right, the big highlights.
Exactly. But if you really want to be well-informed, you have to understand that Spain is a product of these radical reinventions. Our sources all confirm that the story of the Iberian Peninsula is this dense tapestry woven from successive civilizations, and each one completely reshapes what came before.
So our goal for you, the listener, is to connect those dots. We really want to draw out the key figures, the pivotal dates, and maybe most importantly, these persistent arguments, the foundational debates that have just kept defining Spanish identity for centuries.
And we have to start with the geography. You really can't understand Spain without it. Its position is everything.
Okay.
It occupies most of the Iberian Peninsula, of course, but historically and today, its reach is much wider. We have to remember the Balearic Islands, the Canary Islands off Africa, and those crucial North African enclaves Faida and Melilla.
That crossroads location.
Precisely. Between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, Europe and Africa, it has always positioned Spain as this critical point of cultural and military transit, and that has influenced every single historical phase we're about to cover.
So let's begin at the very, very beginning. We're talking deep prehistory. I mean, the earliest evidence of hominids in Western Europe. This predates everything.
It really does. We have to start over 1.4 million years ago.
The
Evidence. It comes from this remarkable archaeological site, Atapuerca, up in the north.
Atapuerca, right.
They found a flint tool there that dates back a staggering 1.4 million years, and early Homo fossils from about 1.2 million years ago. So this establishes the region as, a primary route for early human migration and settlement.
That's just an astonishing length of time. So when do we start to see modern humans, the development of culture as we'd recognize it?
Modern humans, or Cro-Magnons, they arrive in the Iberian Peninsula from north of the Pyrenees around 35,000 years ago. And their culture evolved quite significantly, culminating in this stunning Paleolithic art you see in the Altamira cave.
The famous bison paintings.
Those magnificent paintings of bison and deer, they date to about 15,000 BC. And you can't overstate the significance of Altamira. It reveals this early, really sophisticated cognitive and cultural development that was completely independent of later European civilizations.
Okay, so let's move forward into classical antiquity. Around 100 BC, the Iberian Peninsula wasn't a unified thing at all, was it?
Not even close. It was a mosaic of distinct peoples, a highly stratified tribal landscape.
So who are we talking about?
Well, along the eastern and southern coasts, you had the Iberians. They're known for their distinct material culture, especially their pottery and these impressive carved stone sculptures. They were the first to encounter the Mediterranean trading powers.
And then the Celts.
In the north and center, you have the Celtic peoples. And in the central highlands, you get this blend, a mix of the two cultures known as the Celtiberians.
And they would prove to be a real problem for the Romans later on.
A very fierce opposition.
Yeah.
And we can't forget the mysterious Tartessos.
Ah, yes, the Tartessos. Always shrouded in mystery.
A fascinating civilization that flourished down in the lower Guadalquivir Valley. Tartessos was renowned for its immense wealth, especially in silver and salt. But their decline is, well, it's still a bit of a mystery. Maybe Phoenician economic competition, maybe some local upheaval. They left behind very few written records, which just adds to the legend.
And as you said, the geography meant outside contact was inevitable, coming in from the sea.
The first major contact came from the master mariners and traders, the Phoenicians, specifically from the powerful cities of Tyre and Sidon.
Right.
They established these crucial trading posts starting in the 11th century BCE. The most famous one was Gadir.
Which is modern Cadiz.
Modern Cadiz, exactly. Later, the Greeks arrived and set up their own colonies, but that Phoenician influence was really foundational for early Iberian maritime trade and urban development.
So the Phoenicians and Greeks set the stage, but the true game changer was this titanic global power struggle in the 3rd century BCE, which turned the peninsula into the critical battleground for Carthage and Rome.
The stakes could not have been higher. The Second Punic War, which lasted from 218 to 201 BCE, was just central to Rome's future.
And this is where Hannibal comes in.
Famously, Hannibal, the great Carthaginian general, used Spain as his launching point,
Right.
marched his army and war elephants right across the Alps to attack Rome directly.
But in the end, Rome won out?
Ultimately, yes, they prevailed. They managed to push the Carthaginians out of the peninsula entirely by 206 BCE.
But Roman occupation didn't mean immediate peace, did it? Kicking Carthage out was just the beginning of a whole new fight.
Not at all. The Roman conquest of Iberia, which they renamed Hispania, was slow, gradual, incredibly brutal. They faced continuous, stiff resistance, especially from those Celtiberians in the Central Plains.
I remember reading about the Numantine War.
A prime example.
Mm.
The defenders committed mass suicide rather than surrender to the Romans. It really wasn't until 19 BC, under Emperor Augustus, after these exhaustive and costly Cantabrian wars in the far north, that Rome could finally claim total control.
So once that control was locked down, the Roman legacy was, well, it was indelible. It shaped everything.
They were unparalleled organizers. Hispania became one of the most heavily integrated and prized provinces of the whole empire.
Founding cities that still exist today.
Exactly. Cities like Tarragona, Merita, which was Emerita Augusta, and Saragossa. They built massive public works, aqueducts, huge road networks, linking the peninsula internally and to the rest of the empire. A sophisticated legal system. The very name Spain is a direct linguistic descendant of Hispania.
So we're talking about 4 centuries of really deep integration, and then comes the next great collapse.
That integration couldn't withstand the pressure of the migration period. As Roman authority just dissolved in the West during the 4th and 5th centuries, Germanic tribes surged in.
So who came first, and how did the Visigoths end up on top?
The first groups were people like the Vandals, the Suebi, and the Alans. They invaded and took control of specific regions, often just seizing the existing Roman institutions. The key tribe, though, was the Visigoths.
Right.
They entered Hispania around 415 AD, but initially as foederati, or allies of the Romans, tasked with kicking out the other tribes.
So they were basically hired muscle at first.
You could say that. They established a kingdom, first centered in Toulouse in modern France, but they were pushed out of Gaul by the Franks and systematically took over the peninsula, eventually shifting their capital to Toledo.
So the Visigothic Kingdom of Toledo didn't just want to replace Rome, it aimed to inherit its legitimacy.
Exactly. It was a conscious attempt to present themselves as a successor Roman state. By the late 6th century, they governed nearly all of Iberia. They preserved and adapted Hispano-Roman laws and administrative customs.
But there was a major religious divide, wasn't there?
A crucial one. They had converted to Arian Christianity, a branch considered heretical by Rome around 360 AD. And this created a huge initial divide with the local Hispano-Roman population, who were Nicene or Catholic.
And that was a major challenge to their political stability.
A huge one. It wasn't until the reign of King Recatiferent in 587 that the Visigothic elite officially converted from Arianism to Nicene Catholicism at the Third Council of Toledo.
A political necessity.
Absolutely essential for merging the Visigothic ruling class with the much larger local Hispano-Roman Catholic population.
Yeah.
And so this 2-century-long Visigothic period provided the political and cultural framework, a unified Catholic state with Roman legal underpinnings that existed right up until the early 8th century.
A unity, however, that was clearly fragile. Which brings us to perhaps the most dramatic turning point in the entire history of Spain.
The year 711. This is the cataclysmic event that altered Spanish history forever. The Visigothic kingdom was internally fractured by a succession dispute, basically a civil war.
And the Umayyad forces saw that internal conflict as the perfect opportunity to intervene.
Absolutely. An Islamic Berber conquering party from North Africa, led by the general Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossed the strait that now bears his name, Gibraltar, or Jabal Tariq, Tariq's mountain.
And they intervene in this civil war.
Yes, leading to the decisive Battle of Guadalete on July 19, 711. The Visigothic king Roderick was defeated and killed, and that effectively dissolved the entire centralized power structure.
The speed of the conquest is what often surprises people.
It was stunning. Tariq's commander, Musa ibn Nusair, quickly crossed with Arab reinforcements, and because the Visigothic power structure was so centralized, once the head was gone, resistance just crumbled.
So by 718, they control almost everything.
Nearly the entire peninsula, establishing the territory they named Al-Andalus. Their advance into Western Europe was only halted a few years later by the Franks under Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours in 732. And that established the Pyrenees as a rough cultural boundary for centuries to come.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the foundational dynasty of Al-Andalus didn't come from these conquerors. It came from this dramatic story of political survival thousands of miles away. This is the origin story of the Umayyads in Spain.
It is a phenomenal tale of high-stakes political intrigue. In 750, the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus was violently overthrown by the rival Abbasid revolution, and the Abbasids systematically tried to exterminate the entire Umayyad family.
And one of them escapes.
Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah, known to history as Abd al-Rahman I. He was one of the very few who managed to escape.
And he had to flee through the heart of the Middle East and North Africa. He was essentially the most wanted man in the world.
He and his loyal retainer, Bedor, navigated these incredibly treacherous lands. They fled through Palestine, across the Sinai, into Egypt, always keeping an extremely low profile, fearing assassination at any moment. His goal was Ifriqiya, modern Tunisia, where his mother's Berber tribal ties offered some hope.
But even there, he wasn't safe.
Not at all. He found that the governor of Ifriqiya, a man named Ibn Habib al-Fihri, was a former Umayyad vassal who had declared his own independence. He wasn't about to tolerate a powerful Umayyad claimant challenging his authority.
So Abd al-Rahman had to keep moving.
He had to, so he looked west, and he recognized the internal weakness of Al-Andalus itself. He saw that it was plagued by intense and long-running ethnic and tribal tensions between the Arab elite and the Berber soldiers.
A perfect opportunity to exploit.
Exactly. Abd al-Rahman arrived with the prestige of the legitimate former dynasty. In 756, supported by these discontented factions, he proclaimed himself the independent emir of Al-Andalus, and he established Córdoba as his capital.
So he was politically independent, but did he still recognize the Abbasids at all?
That's a great question. He exercised complete autonomous governmental control, but often he would acknowledge the Abbasid Caliphate's religious authority. It was a pragmatic move sometimes to avoid a holy war, but he also ignored it completely depending on the political necessity of the moment. The key point is that Córdoba was now functionally independent from the Abbasid East.
And that political independence laid the groundwork for this immense cultural and economic flowering, the so-called Golden Age.
Abd al-Rahman VI's reign was absolutely foundational. It lasted until his death in 788. He established the political stability needed for growth and, of course, initiated the most enduring architectural legacy, the construction of the Great Mosque of Córdoba in 785.
And his successors consolidated that power, turning the emirate into a recognized Mediterranean superpower.
His grandson, Abd al-Rahman II, who reigned from 822, was the first great patron of Córdoba. He reorganized the bureaucracy along very sophisticated lines, mimicking the centralized administration in the East, which boosted efficiency. He commissioned new mosques, infrastructure. It was a remarkable period where science and art flourished.
And we even see the spirit of scientific inquiry that seems centuries ahead of its time in Western Europe.
Oh, absolutely. The scholar Abbas ibn Firnas, he was famous for his intellectual versatility. Sources credit him with early experiments in aviation, designing and attempting to fly with rudimentary wings.
That's incredible.
It's an astonishing example of pushing technological boundaries. And that spirit of inquiry really defined the era.
The ultimate peak, though, was the declaration of the Caliphate itself.
That happened under Abd al-Rahman III, who took the title of Caliph in 929 CE. And under his rule, Córdoba became truly unique. It was arguably the most populous and civilized city in the Western world, maybe with a population of over 500,000. It was famous for its illuminated streets, public baths, hospitals, extensive libraries with hundreds of thousands of volumes, all centered around the majestic Mesquita.
Now, this era is synonymous with La Convivencia, the idea of a multi-religious society. We should be clear about what that actually meant. Was it truly a utopia of tolerance?
That's a crucial distinction. It wasn't a utopia, it was a pragmatic, sophisticated, but also stratified society. The population included Arabs, Berbers, and the Muwalladun Muslims of Hispanic origin, who eventually became the majority. For Christians and Jews, life was governed by the dhimmi system.
And how did that system function in practice?
It designated Christians and Jews as dhimmis, or protected subordinate groups. It allowed them to practice their faith, maintain their own courts for internal affairs, own property. In exchange, they were restricted in certain areas like public office, barred from proselytizing, and critically, they had to pay a special head tax, the jizya.
So it's subordinate, but protected.
Exactly. And while it was generally tolerant by the standards of the time, that status was explicitly subordinate, and the level of tolerance could vary dramatically depending on who was in power and the external military threat.
Yet, intellectually, the fusion of these cultures yielded these immense heights that influenced European thought for centuries.
Immense heights. Andalusi scholars were reintroducing, revising, and critiquing classical Greek thought centuries before the European Renaissance. In astronomy and philosophy, you have figures like Ibn Tufayl, Ibn Rushd, and Nur ad-Din al-Batruji. They weren't just translating Ptolemy, they were actively trying to overcome the physical impossibilities in his models, favoring a pure Aristotelian model.
Really pushing the science forward.
Pushing it forward. Batruji's book on cosmology became hugely influential and later fueled scholasticism in the Latin West.
But despite all the grandeur of Al-Andalus, the story of Christian resistance began almost immediately, right up in the inhospitable northern mountains.
The Christian nucleus emerged around 718 in the Cantabrian Mountains, forming the Kingdom of Asturias. And this kingdom was sustained not by continuity with the old Visigothic court, but by the determined independence of the native groups, the Astures, Galicians, and Basques, who had never really been fully integrated into that Hispano-Gothic society.
And the whole narrative centers on this one small battle at Covadonga.
That battle, led by Pelagius, was initially just a minor skirmish against a Muslim force. But over centuries of retelling, it was magnified into this pivotal foundation myth, the symbolic birth of the Reconquista, the nearly 800-year process of Christian expansion south.
And as the kingdom consolidated, its leaders began this process of political myth-making to legitimize that expansion.
Precisely. The Asturian kingdom evolved into the Kingdom of Leon, and later kings, like Alfonso III, actively promoted the idea that their realm was the direct, legitimate heir of Visigothic Toledo.
Which was a political device, not really historical reality.
Exactly. It was designed to vindicate their territorial claims against the Muslim rulers and to unify the diverse peoples under their crown with a shared religious and historical story.
And religion became the great unifying and mobilizing force for this entire mission.
The single greatest religious and political discovery was the alleged finding of the bones of St. James the Great Santiago around the year 813.
Right, in Compostela.
And what would become Santiago de Compostela. This event provided a powerful spiritual rallying point, and, crucially, it initiated the flow of pilgrims, the Way of St. James, which integrated these nascent Christian kingdoms into the wider network of Christian Europe. It supplied money, ideas, and a constant stream of religious zeal.
The real turning point, though, came from within Al-Andalus itself. The collapse of the Central Caliphate in the 11th century gave the Christian kingdoms the critical advantage they needed.
The Caliphate collapsed, splintering into these numerous fragmented successor states known as the Taifa states. This fragmentation was economically devastating but politically crucial because it meant the Muslim rulers could no longer present a unified front.
And what's the key economic insight here? These Taifa states were individually rich, but their weakness meant they were literally financing the very armies trying to destroy them.
That's the core structural paradox. The Christian kingdoms, though ideologically opposed, were militarily weaker than the sum of the Taifas. So they exploited this by forcing the Taifas to pay massive amounts of annual tribute, known as pariahs, in exchange for protection from other Christian armies.
So they were subsidizing the Reconquista.
In essence, yes. The Taifas were economically rich but politically paralyzed, pouring gold into the coffers of their northern enemies.
And facing total collapse, the Taifa rulers had to appeal for help from Africa, not once, but twice.
First, they appealed to the Almoravids, a powerful fundamentalist Berber group led by Yusuf ibn Tashfin. They crossed the strait, defeated the Crusaders, and brought temporary stability. But they ultimately ended the Taifa system and imposed their own, much stricter rule.
And when they weakened?
They were succeeded by another fundamentalist North African empire, the Almohads.
The Almohads, however, were spread too thin, fighting a war on two continents.
Exactly. They were desperately engaged in a two-front war. In Africa, they faced internal enemies, and in Iberia, they faced the growing power of the Christian coalition. And the emergence of a weak and inexperienced leader, Nasir al-Din, proved to be catastrophic for them.
Which led to the single most decisive battle of the entire Reconquista.
The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. A massive coalition of Christian kings Leon, Castile, Aragon, and Navarre achieved an absolutely crushing victory over the Almohad forces. This was the final, devastating blow to the Muslims as a major military power in Iberia.
And the aftermath was swift.
A rapid Christian overrun of Al-Andalus, leaving only the tiny, politically isolated emirate of Granada, which survived solely by maneuvering diplomatically and paying tribute to Castile until the very end of the 15th century.
So we jump forward to the late 15th century, where the modern Spanish state really begins to coalesce, all rooted in a pivotal dynastic marriage.
The marriage of Isabel I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon in 1469. This created a personal union, and this event is rightly considered the political foundation of a unified Spanish monarchy under the House of Trastamara. It combined the vast territory of Castile and the mercantile power of Aragon.
And they immediately set about establishing the three defining pillars of their reign: territorial unity, religious uniformity, and global expansion. And all of it comes to a head in the year 1492.
That year is just unparalleled in its concentration of world-changing events. First, you have territorial unity. The Granada War, which had been going on since 1482, finally ended with Granada's surrender on January 2nd. That concluded 781 years of Islamic rule.
Then came the catastrophic turn toward religious uniformity.
This was formalized in March 1492 with the Alhambra Decree. It mandated the expulsion of all Jews who refused to convert to Christianity. This action caused immense suffering. Hundreds of thousands were forced to flee. And it was a profound act of economic self-sabotage.
A loss of crucial financial, scholarly, and trade expertise.
Exactly. Expertise that had underpinned the peninsula's economy for centuries.
And those who converted the conversos, they weren't safe either.
No. The Spanish Inquisition, which had been established earlier, was ramped up dramatically to target these converts, and later the Moriscos converted Muslims who were suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths.
So for the Catholic monarchs, religious unity was politically essential, ideological purity over economic pragmatism.
Completely. And finally, 1492 saw the launch of the project that would make Spain a global empire. Isabella and Ferdinand sponsored Christopher Columbus's first voyage. He set sail in August and made landfall in the Bahamas on October 12, 1492. And this wasn't just a discovery. It was the beginning of the colonization of the Americas and the claim to resources and territory that would define Spain for the next 300 years.
The stage was now set for the Habsburg dynasty, which inherited this new global domain.
The first Habsburg ruler was Charles I, who became King of Spain in 1516. Because of his vast inheritance, he also became Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He presided over a domain so scattered, from Central Europe to Naples to the Americas, that he famously said the sun never set on his empire.
And this era is defined by the Conquistadors, who rapidly carved out the mainland empires in the Americas.
Hernán Cortés's expedition to Mexico starting in 1519 is the prime example. He systematically defeated the immense Aztec Empire, capturing their capital, Tenochtitlan, despite setbacks like La Noche Triste.
And these conquests, along with Pizarro's in Peru, revealed staggering wealth in silver and gold.
Staggering. And the Spanish immediately established their institutions. Municipal councils, the church undertaking massive missionary work, and this very strict city planning, characterized by the central plaza mayor and grid-like streets, which you see replicated all across Latin America.
And imperial power reached its territorial peak under Charles's son, Philip II.
Philip II inherited the Spanish Empire in 1556, and he chose to focus his immense bureaucratic power on Castile. His empire grew even larger when he successfully incorporated Portugal and its vast colonies in 1580, establishing the Iberian Union. This period, culturally, was Spain's Siglo de Oro, its golden age.
El Viejo Cervantes.
Exactly. And militarily, he secured a major victory against the rising power of the Ottoman Empire.
The Battle of Lepanto.
Yes, his forces stopped the Ottoman advance in the Western Mediterranean at the pivotal Battle of Lepanto in 1571, cementing Spain's role as the defender of Catholic Europe.
But the seeds of decline were already growing, ironically, from the very wealth and scale of the empire itself.
The resources were finite, and the financial demands were infinite. The defeat of the Spanish Armada by England in 1588 was an enormous psychological and financial blow. It strained an already overextended state and emboldened rivals.
And then there was the constant warring in Europe.
The 80 Years' War, the Dutch Revolt starting in 1568, this constant warring devoured the American silver, which wasn't used to develop domestic Spanish industries, but instead flowed out to pay foreign armies and foreign suppliers.
So the key insight here is that American silver wasn't a national treasure. It was more like a highly inflationary, temporary currency that was just fueling foreign debts.
Exactly. It created an economic curse. Inflation skyrocketed, and Spain became dependent on imported finished goods. The crown became trapped in this cycle where American silver impoverished Spain, while ironically enriching the northern European merchants and bankers who financed the Habsburg Wars.
The 17th century saw this slow, painful decline accelerate under the less effective minor Habsburgs.
Under Philip III, the decline worsened. His costly foreign policy couldn't be sustained, leading to widespread domestic distress. And this was made critically worse by the Second Great Expulsion, the expulsion of the Moriscos between 1609 and 1614.
The descendants of converted Muslims, what was the specific impact of that?
It severely harmed the agricultural sector, particularly in regions like Valencia and Aragon, where the Moriscos formed the essential, highly skilled labor base for irrigation-based farming.
So another case where ideological uniformity was prioritized over essential economic function.
Exactly, costing Spain a significant portion of its remaining skilled population.
Philip V tried to reverse the course, entrusting governance to a strong minister, the Count Duke of Olivares.
Olivares was an ambitious reformer. He recognized the need for change. He attempted this massive program of centralization, the Unión de Armas, seeking to distribute the military and tax burden across all Spanish realms, not just Castile.
An attempt at mandatory fiscal unification,
Which triggered immediate and violent resistance.
leading directly to the major internal revolt of 1640.
Yes. The War of the Reapers in Catalonia and, most critically, the uprising in Portugal in 1640, which successfully secured Portugal's independence and enthroned the House of Braganza. Olivares' attempts to save the empire paradoxically accelerated its fragmentation.
And militarily, the 17th century was defined by these devastating symbolic defeats against France.
The most famous defeat was the Battle of Rocroi in 1643 during the 30 Years' War. This French victory just shattered the legendary reputation of the Spanish tercios, the famed infantry units. Rocroi symbolized the definitive loss of Spanish military dominance in Europe.
And the Habsburg line finally died out with a biologically weakened monarch.
Charles II, known as the Bewitched, he was the last Habsburg, physically and mentally frail, the tragic result of generations of dynastic inbreeding designed to keep the immense family inheritance intact.
So he couldn't produce an heir.
Correct. And his death in 1700 without a direct heir became the fuse for the powder keg. It ignited the War of the Spanish Succession.
So Charles II's death plunged Europe into this massive geopolitical conflict because nobody wanted a Spanish French superstate ruled by the mighty House of Bourbon.
The core issue was the balance of power. The war was fought between the French-backed contender, Philip of Anjou-Louis de Vichy's grandson, and the Archduke Charles of Austria, the Habsburg claimant.
And crucially, this wasn't just an international conflict, it was a devastating civil war inside Spain.
Yes, Castile largely supported the Bourbon claim, while Aragon, Catalonia, and Valencia feared Bourbon centralization and favored the Austrian Habsburg claim.
The resolution, the Treaty of Utrecht, was definitive in confirming Spain's diminished status as a European power.
The treaty recognized Philip V as the King of Spain, establishing the Bourbon dynasty, but the cost was immense. Philip V had to renounce any right to the French throne, severing that dynastic link.
And Spain ceded key European territories, the Spanish Netherlands, Italian lands, and critically, Gibraltar and Minorca to Great Britain.
So Spain was no longer a major player in continental power politics.
Not at all. The new Bourbon kings immediately set about rebuilding the state through French-style centralization.
Philip V and his successors introduced the Nueva Planta decrees. These decrees were punitive against the regions that had supported the Austrian cause like Catalonia and Valencia, and they abolished their traditional laws, institutions, and unique governing structures, cementing a unified, highly centralized administrative state modeled after France.
Later in the 18th century, the focus shifted to economic and social modernization, inspired by the European Enlightenment.
Under Charles III, significant reforms were implemented to lift Spain out of its economic stagnation. He fostered science, infrastructure development, rationalized commerce and agriculture. He even managed to significantly reduce the power of the Church and the Inquisition, which had long been obstacles to modernization.
And Spain regained some international prestige.
It did, notably through its successful involvement supporting the Americans in their War of Independence.
But the age of revolutions, first French, then American, finally reached Spain, destroying the Bourbon system in the early 1800s.
The Peninsular War, from 1808 to 1814, was a brutal national conflict. It started when Napoleon seized the Spanish throne and installed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte. The Dos de Mayo uprising in Madrid in 1808 sparked this massive,
grassroots guerrilla resistance.
A war of attrition.
A devastating one. Spanish militias, aided by British and Portuguese forces under Wellington, eventually expelled the French.
The great tragedy of the Peninsular War is that the fight for national liberty at home created the perfect storm for the permanent loss of empire abroad.
The collapse of central Spanish authority during the French occupation created the necessary political vacuum. Criollo elites in the colonies, long resentful of the privileges granted to peninsular elites, seized this opportunity, sparking the Spanish-American Wars of Independence, which raged from 1809 to 1826.
And the loss was comprehensive and final.
By the final defeat at the Battle of Ayacucho in 1824, Spain had lost every single mainland American holding. It retained only the Caribbean islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico.
And the country was left in ruins.
Economically ruinous. And it plunged the newly liberated Spain into a century of intense political instability. The country was left economically shattered, deeply divided, and characterized by widespread poverty. About 3/4 of the population was illiterate.
Instability defined the 19th century, starting immediately with a dynastic dispute that escalated into full-blown civil conflicts, the Carlist Wars.
Ferdinand VII's death in 1833 sparked the First Carlist War. The conflict pitted the liberals supporting his daughter, Isabella II, against this ultra-traditionalist, reactionary legitimist movement supporting his brother, Don Carlos.
And these weren't just about succession, were they?
No, they were fundamentally ideological, pitting forces favoring centralized, absolute monarchy and traditional Catholicism against those favoring liberal constitutional governance and regional autonomy.
Isabella II's reign itself was just plagued by military coups and constant factionalism.
A revolving door of political instability. We saw periods of authoritarian military rule, like the Regency of Baldomero Esportero, and the two main political factions, the moderates and the progressives, continuously sought power through military means rather than parliamentary ones.
The ultimate result of all this turbulence was the deposition of Isabella II and a short, chaotic attempt at full democracy.
The Glorious Revolution of 1868 deposed the Queen, leading to the Sexenio Democratico. This democratic experiment was just too fragile to survive the ideological divides. It included the brief, unsuccessful reign of an Italian king, Amadeo I, followed by the highly tumultuous First Spanish Republic, which collapsed amid Carlist violence and cantonalist revolts. It just demonstrated the deep-seated fragmentation of the country.
Stability only returned with the Bourbon Restoration of 1875, but that stability was built on institutionalized corruption.
Alfonso XII established the Restoration, a system designed by Cánovas del Castillo. The core mechanism was turnismo, the prearranged alternating of power between the conservative and liberal parties.
So it ensured political continuity, but it was entirely superficial.
Completely. It relied on massive electoral fraud.
And that fraud was enforced through a specific technical mechanism.
It relied on caciquismo, local political bossism, where powerful local figures, the caciques, dictated voting outcomes. The manipulated election results were known as pucherazo. So while stability was achieved, true democracy was not, leading to widespread cynicism about the political class.
And the greatest shock to this fragile system came at the end of the century, ending the last remnants of the empire.
The Spanish-American War of 1898. The conflict was sparked by American sympathy for Cuban revolutionaries and, critically, the sinking of the USS Maine. Spain's fleets were rapidly destroyed in both the Pacific and the Caribbean.
A massive humiliation.
The Treaty of Paris forced the cession of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and the sale of the Philippines. This was a massive, humiliating shock, the disaster of 1898, that shattered Spain's self-image and triggered a profound intellectual crisis about the state of the nation.
And even Spain's neutrality in World War I couldn't paper over the mounting internal instability.
Neutrality led to an economic boom, but also rampant inflation and profound social distress. This culminated in the three-headed crisis of 1917, a major revolutionary strike, a military crisis over promotion standards, and a political crisis fueled by growing Catalan nationalism. The ruling turnismo system, already corrupted by pucherazo, was cracking under the pressure of real social and economic dislocation.
The political cracks finally gave way in the 1930s. Following the collapse of the Primo de Rivera dictatorship in 1930, the municipal elections of April 1931 delivered a Republican landslide.
King Alfonso III, seeing the writing on the wall, chose to go into exile rather than risk civil war. The Second Republic was proclaimed on April 14, 1931, and the new government immediately embarked on these ambitious yet very polarizing reforms involving agrarian redistribution, military restructuring, and church-state separation.
But this era was immediately defined by violent political polarization between the extreme left and right.
The first 2 years, the Reformist Biennium, were marked by intense political division and immediate anti-clerical violence. Churches and religious institutions were burned in Madrid and Seville in May 1931. The secularizing and reformist agenda just alienated significant portions of the military, the church, and the landed elite.
And the political dynamic shifted drastically with the Black Biennium.
The 1933 elections brought a conservative victory. When the conservative Catholic coalition CETA eventually entered the government in October 1934, the Socialist Party triggered a massive general strike and insurrection. This became a bloody revolutionary uprising, particularly in the northern mining region of Asturias.
And the brutal repression of that revolt became a direct precursor to the Civil War itself.
The Republican government entrusted the brutal crushing of the 1934 Asturian revolt to the military, notably the African army led by General Francisco Franco. This act solidified the military's role as the enforcer of social order and deepened the irreconcilable mistrust between the political left and the military establishment.
The ultimate catalyst for the Civil War was the Popular Front victory in the 1936 election, followed by spiraling violence.
The victory of the Popular Front, a coalition of communists, socialists, and Republican leftists, fueled fears among the conservative military and political elite. Violence and political assassinations escalated dramatically. Although a military coup conspiracy led by General Mola was already underway, the assassination of José Calvo Sotelo, the anti-socialist parliamentary leader carried out by Republican police elements, was the breaking point.
That transformed the conspiracy into a full-scale revolt.
Exactly. Transformed a limping conspiracy into a full-scale revolt.
The partial failure of the coup in July 1936 resulted in 3 years of total war, dividing the country into two main internally fractured factions.
The conflict pitted the nationalists, a coalition including Carlist monarchists, the fascist Falange, and traditionalist Catholic elements against the Republicans, who were comprised of the Popular Front government, along with powerful, often competing anarchist, communist, and socialist militias.
And it was a testing ground for international powers, a rehearsal for World War II.
The international dimension was essential. The nationalists received crucial non-stop air and ground support from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. The German Condor Legion tested tactics and equipment,
including the infamous bombing of Guernica.
Yes, the bombing of Guernica in April 1937, which showed the devastating power of terror bombing on civilian targets. On the Republican side, support came primarily from the Soviet Union and Mexico, supplemented by about 32,000 international volunteers in the international brigades.
What were the key military moments that allowed Franco, who secured Seville early on, to eventually prevail?
Franco secured Seville by organizing an air bridge, transferring 1,500 highly experienced soldiers from the Army of Africa, which was crucial to rebel control in the south. The nationalists pursued a relentless strategy, often relying on foreign air support to break stalemates.
And the key turning point.
The nationalist arrival in Vinaròs in April 1938 cut the Republican zone in two, effectively paralyzing their communication. The Battle of the Ebro in the summer of 1938 was the Republicans' final, exhausted offensive. Its failure sealed their fate, leading to the fall of Catalonia and the final surrender of Madrid on April 1, 1939.
And the conflict was marked by systematic, widespread, and extreme brutality on both sides.
The sources are very clear on the horror. The nationalists employed a policy of limpieza cleansing aimed at eradicating political opponents and securing long-term ideological control. This resulted in an estimated 130,000 to 200,000 executions.
And in the Republican zone,
the collapse of state authority led to an explosion of anti-clerical terror, resulting in the murder of 6,832 religious figures, including priests, monks, friars, and 13 bishops. Historians note that in some dioceses, the majority of secular priests were killed with extreme cruelty.
Following the nationalist victory, Franco established a deeply authoritarian regime that lasted nearly 4 decades, built on a very specific, unitary ideology.
The regime was based on authoritarianism, the total suppression of regional identities, and centrally national Catholicism. Catholicism was explicitly the state religion. Religious pluralism was suppressed, and the regime often promoted conspiracy theories, with Franco personally believing in an international conspiracy of Judeo-Masonry and communists seeking to undermine Spain.
And Franco famously walked a tightrope during World War II, maintaining non-belligerence despite his ideological sympathy for Hitler and Mussolini.
He was pragmatic. Spain was too exhausted from the Civil War to enter a major global conflict. While he offered rhetorical support and sent the Blue Division Spanish volunteers to fight on the Eastern Front, He avoided full belligerence.
And after the war, Spain was isolated.
Harsh international isolation, excluded from the UN and international aid packages. That isolation only ended when the Cold War fundamentally changed Western priorities.
The U.S. saw Spain as a strategic ally.
It's exactly. The United States, looking for strategic allies against the Soviet Union in the Mediterranean, saw Franco's anti-communist stance as strategically vital. This external pressure, coupled with pressure from the IMF, forced the regime to gradually abandon its failed policy of autarky economic self-sufficiency and adopt free market policies.
And this shift marked the beginning of Spain's massive economic transformation, the Spanish miracle.
The shift was led by technocrats and members of the conservative Catholic organization Opus Dei, who replaced the old guard. The 1959 Stabilization and Liberalization Plan focused on trade liberalization and fiscal stability. And the 1960s saw unprecedented growth fueled by three major factors: massive industrialization, internal migration of labor from rural to industrial areas, and the explosive growth of mass tourism, which brought crucial foreign currency.
And the era finally closed with the dictator's death.
Francisco Franco died on November 20, 1975, having ruled for over 36 years. The physical and symbolic end of the regime was confirmed years later, when his body was controversially exhumed from the monumental Valley of the Fallen in 2019, reflecting the ongoing struggle to reconcile with the dictatorship's legacy.
The transition from the Franco state to a full democracy was remarkably swift and generally peaceful, largely initiated by figures from within the old regime structure.
King Juan Carlos I, whom Franco had designated as his successor, played the critical role in dismantling the authoritarian structure. He appointed Adolfo Suarez, a former Francoist official, as prime minister.
A surprising choice.
It was, but Suarez, despite his background, was committed to reform. He worked swiftly to dismantle Francoist institutions, legalize political parties and trade unions, and grant amnesty for political crimes,
Paving the way for the fundamental document of modern Spain.
The first democratic elections since 1936 were held in 1977. The subsequent Constituent Assembly drafted the 1978 Constitution, which was overwhelmingly approved by referendum. This document established Spain as a parliamentary monarchy, enshrined the rule of law, guaranteed fundamental rights, and critically ended Catholicism's status as the state religion, establishing state-sponsored religious pluralism.
One of the immediate and most complex challenges for the new democracy was resolving Spain's centuries-long debate between centralization and regional identity.
The Constitution mandated a process of decentralization, granting self-governance to the regions. Statutes of autonomy were quickly approved for the historical reasons, Catalonia and Euskadi, the Basque Country, in 1979.
But then it became more complicated.
The subsequent 1980 Andalusian referendum forced the government to generalize these maximum competencies to other regions, creating the phenomenon known as the coffee for all approach, where all 17 autonomous communities eventually received similar powers.
But the early years were also deeply unstable, marked by economic distress and political violence.
The transition coincided with high global inflation and surging domestic unemployment. And this volatile economic climate was compounded by what became known as the Years of Lead, from 1978 to 1980, marked by severe violence from the Basque separatist group ETA.
How bad was it?
ETA killed 240 people during this period, with 1980 being the bloodiest year on record. This instability contributed directly to Suarez's resignation in 1981, and a failed military coup attempt later that year highlighted just how fragile the new democracy was.
So, seeking greater stability and economic legitimacy, Spain looked outward toward Europe.
International integration was absolutely vital for cementing democracy. Spain joined the European Economic Community, now the EU, in 1986. At the time, its GDP per capita was significantly lower than the European average, only about 72%, which highlights the scale of the economic convergence challenge ahead.
The decades following EU accession saw this massive economic convergence, transforming Spain into a modern European economy.
Between 1997 and 2008, Spain experienced a profound economic boom, often called the Second Spanish Miracle. By 2007, the GDP per capita had reached 105% of the EU average, which is a remarkable success.
And it became a major investor abroad.
The second largest foreign investor in Latin America. And this prosperity fueled high immigration. The foreign-born population reached over 10% of the total.
But that growth was fundamentally built on an unsustainable housing bubble.
The global financial crisis of 2008 hit Spain severely when that domestic housing bubble burst. Construction, which had fueled job growth, collapsed. Unemployment soared, reaching over 20% by 2011, with 5 million people out of work.
Forcing severe austerity measures.
Yes, including the reduction of civil servant salaries and freezing pensions under Prime Minister Zapatero.
And the crisis caused a demographic reversal, pushing people out of Spain for the first time in decades.
Emigration exceeded immigration. Many recent immigrants returned home, and tens of thousands of young, highly educated Spaniards sought better opportunities elsewhere in the EU. The crisis deeply fractured the social contract.
And this social discontent translated directly into the fragmentation of the political system.
The crisis fueled the Indignados, or 15M movement, a massive wave of public protests against austerity and political corruption. By the 2015 general election, the traditional two-party system was shattered. The PP and PSOE lost half their combined vote share to new parties, leading to unprecedented political fragmentation and a deadlock where the parliament was unable to invest a new prime minister for months.
This fragmentation coincided with the most serious constitutional crisis since the transition, the Catalan independence movement.
In 2017, following an unsanctioned referendum, the Catalan parliament unilaterally declared independence. Madrid responded swiftly and decisively,
Invoking Article 155.
Yes, the Spanish Senate, with a vote of 214 to 47, invoked Article 155 of the Constitution. This unprecedented move allowed the central government to remove the secessionist leaders and rule the autonomous region directly from Madrid, temporarily suspending the political autonomy of Catalonia.
Looking at the most recent data, how does the Spanish economy stand today, particularly after the global pandemic?
The economy has demonstrated significant resilience. GDP fully recovered to pre-pandemic levels by the first quarter of 2023. Economic activity remains robust, with projected growth at 2.9% in 2025. And critically, Spain's GDP per capita, adjusted for purchasing power, has reached 92% of the EU average in 2024, showing that continued convergence toward the European core.
And finally, a look at the modern demographic profile, a major contrast to the expulsions centuries ago.
Spain is now firmly established as a destination country for migration. As of July 2025, official statistics indicate that approximately 19.64% of the total population was born abroad. This reflects a massive societal and demographic shift, positioning Spain as one of Europe's most culturally and ethnically diverse nations in the 21st century.
What an incredible journey from the flint tools of Atapuerca through the unifying yet fragile Visigothic state, the astonishing cultural and intellectual synthesis of Al-Andalus,
The dizzying heights of the Habsburg global empire and its subsequent crippling decline.
the tumult of the 19th century, and finally the hard-won yet fragile democracy of the late 20th and early 21st century.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the history of Spain is defined by its ability to synthesize multiple cultures and continually reinvent itself following periods of profound collapse. But running underneath this entire narrative are two persistent structural debates that span centuries: the tension between absolute centralization versus regional autonomy, and the dangerous temptation to prioritize ideological purity over economic pragmatism. These debates continue to define Spain today.
We discussed the profound social and economic costs of the expulsions of the Jews in 1492 and the Moriscos in 1609, where ideological purity led to the removal of essential human capital. Now, in the 21st century, Spain is seeing the opposite: massive population growth fueled by immigration, with nearly 20% of the population born abroad.
And the forces show Spain is expected to continue experiencing robust economic growth through at least 2027, increasingly integrated into the European economy. This raises an important and, I think, provocative question. What impact will today's current foreign-born population, a level not seen in centuries, have on Spanish identity and its economic trajectory in the next 100 years? Will this new synthesis of cultures successfully assimilate into the centuries-old conversation about what it means to be Spanish? Or will it present a new chapter in the country's recurring debate over national identity and integration? That is the complex history that you now get to watch unfold.